Have you ever written such letters, full of patience yet filled with obscure sorrow, with nowhere to send them? The first letter, meeting Steve Watson in the brilliant summer, the riverside street blossomed with unparalleled beauty. The second letter, life and death parted, and in the place furthest from Linda, I finally discovered her secret. The third letter, an outstanding student, though small in stature, liking you is my little secret. The fourth letter, bearing the truth of my parents' death, how can I love you with all my heart? The fifth letter, Steve Watson, for all that you have done for me, risking your life, I can only repay you with my own. The 14th letter, I wrote you 14 letters, all soaked in tears. Looking back at the 23rd Street where you once lived, I still couldn't see you. These 14 letters expressed the tragic song of youth. A girl consumed by hatred turned her pain into a parting sorrow. The boy silently guarding the riverside street left his life in that cool summer. Welcome to the Painful Youth novel series The Summer Letters from Riverside Street, authored by Lu Lin Yan Ba Bok Diu. This work is proudly presented by Xuan Lu Van Hoa. Episode 1, the postman responsible for this area always had a dilemma. He often received strange letters, written openly with the sender's name as Alice and the recipient as Steve Watson. However, the addresses were either completely undeliverable or the letters were returned from some remote corners. The mottled postmarks represented real places, but the back of the letters were mechanically stamped with, "No such person found." Behind his back, everyone referred to the sender as, Miss Trouble of number 23. It was a dreary, rainy day. The postman almost ran into a pedestrian at the red light. He cursed under his breath and then pedaled through the wind. The leaves were slick like rose walls drenched in oil. Frustrated, he pushed open the ivory-colored gate and then the iron-blue door, tossing the crumpled letters and newspapers into the girl's lap, saying in a harsh tone, "Miss Alice, please don't send such letters anymore and add to our workload." The postman, who had been patient up until now, finally felt the urge to punch the girl. But, Miss Trouble of number 23 cheerfully flipped through the newspaper, reading every article with interest. She rested her chin on her left hand and smiled, "Playing pranks is really exhausting. Don't worry, I won't do it anymore." The postman angrily waved his sleeve and left, but the next second, that girl burst into tears, crying uncontrollably. That girl was me, Alice, because I finally understood that from now on, there would no longer be Steve Watson in this world. The morning paper had just published the news that at 8:30 p.m. last night, he had taken his life in prison with a piece of porcelain. I still remember that not long ago, he had called me for the first time, wishing me a happy 20th birthday. At the end of the call, he gently asked, "Tutu, are you sad? Sad because all these years, there hasn't been someone you truly loved in your heart." In truth, I so desperately wanted to admit that I liked him very much, so very much. But he didn't wait for my confession and chose to leave me forever. From then on, the unsent letters became the only thing that comforted me, becoming the deepest and most profound part of my soul. Yet, I never spoke of them, because I feared that if I did, I would no longer be myself. The first letter, the windowsill on Riverside Street, where wild chrysanthemums bloomed. I am the girl who lives in the past. Growing up, I read Zhang Ailing and remembered what she mentioned. In the cold February of 1946, Zhang Ailing left to visit her husband in Wenzhou. She told Hu Lansheng, "I came from Zhuji Lishui, and along the way, I kept thinking, this is the path you walked on. I squeezed onto the boat, looking out for you, and when I saw Wenzhou city, I thought you were there." The city of Wenzhou seemed to glow with jewels. When she went to see him, she still thought, "I'm walking on the road you've walked, seeing the sights you've seen," and her heart was filled with joy. But at that time, I was still so young, fresh as a flower, and didn't understand the emotions of the master. When she saw him, she felt so small, as if she had shrunk into the dust, but in her heart, there was joy, and from that dust bloomed a flower of tenderness. I didn't know if Riverside Street would bring me the long-lost warmth in my heart. The large truck rumbled along the asphalt road, far past the city. The scenes quickly receded, the wild chrysanthemum fields in full bloom, the river gently flowing beside the overpass, and the waves of wheat fields in the summer breeze, stretching out to the horizon. I watched everything outside the window, then glanced at my reflection in the glass. Turning my head, I asked Linda beside me, puzzled, "Linda, are we really moving to the countryside?" Linda ruffled my hair and smiled tiredly. "It's the suburbs, not the countryside." "But what's the difference?" "It's just as poor, and there's not even a place to buy food for Buddy." I looked down at Buddy in my arms and asked, "Buddy, shall we move to the suburbs?" "Woof!" The dog barked. I excitedly shouted, "Linda," Buddy said, "Wonderful, he's very happy." Linda hugged me and sighed softly with a hint of affection, "Alice, you're so sensible." "Am I sensible?" "No, I'm not. It's just that life's upheavals have long since taught me that adults love obedient children. So I worked hard to hide my rebellious nature, transforming into a quiet and well-behaved girl. But perhaps only I know that inside me, there's a dark and damp mossy swamp. Of course, I rarely let that side of me show. Linda brought me to a place called Riverside Street, which indeed is on the outskirts of the city. Next to it, there's a construction site for a project grandly called the Chinese Versailles Palace. The land here is cheap, so the project is being built on a massive scale. Once it's finished, the land price will skyrocket, and making a profit will be effortless. But for now, just like the song says, though I am ugly, I am gentle. Riverside Street may look poor on the outside, but its soul is rich. The small, shabby houses line up like toy blocks. Linda and I live at number 23, easy to recognize because in summer, the fluffy branches and leaves cover the low walls. Huge, dark red roses bloom and stretch out into the gradually deepening blue air. The moving company bustles in and out of number 23, taking half a day to get everything sorted. So I sat under the rose wall, holding Buddy, waiting. Because some things here were new to the people of Riverside Street, Steve Watson, curious, came along with his group of friends to watch the excitement. It was a scorching July day. He was wearing only a pair of oversized beach shorts from Uncle Watson, walking in size 43 flip-flops, waddling like a penguin, and waving a paper fan. He greeted me in a slick tone, "Hey, pretty girl." That flimsy paper fan couldn't generate any wind at all. It seemed to be for show rather than function. And all I could think as I looked at Steve Watson standing in front of me was that he gave off the vibe of an ancient nobleman teasing an innocent woman. Upon closer inspection, it turned out he really was a rich playboy. The fan was made from banknotes glued together, but sadly, they were all just 1 yuan bills. Inside, I was overwhelmed with awe, and my admiration for him reached a level that couldn't even be described in Chinese. "SB, I muttered. "What's SB?" Steve Watson, with wide, curious eyes, asked me. I rolled my eyes to the sky in silence. He turned to his friends and asked, "What is SB?" One of his friends was about to explain, but I quickly interrupted, "You misheard. I didn't say SB, I said BS." "And what's BS?" he asked. I shook my head with a look of disdain, sighing deeply, "If you don't get it, never mind." Am I supposed to tell him, "Do you really have no knowledge?" Even without knowledge, you should at least have some common sense, right? And if not common sense, surely you've watched TV before. Just as my conversation with Steve Watson was about to fall apart, Wendy Watson, the spoiled miss, came out from his house. She was dressed in bright, garish colors, swaying her hips as she walked toward me, putting on a pretentious air. With a proud look that could rival mine, Wendy Watson appeared. I have to mention her here. She's 18 this year and considers herself the most beautiful flower not only on Riverside Street, but across the entire 18th Street radius. She spends her days idly reciting overly dramatic poems in her posh home, acting as if life itself has left her. The air quickly filled with the scent of cheap perfume, so strong it made me sneeze 3 times. Achoo! 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 On the last sneeze, I sneezed so hard that I accidentally sprayed saliva all over Steve Watson, who was standing too close to me. Wendy Watson immediately burst out laughing so hard that even the powder on her face started to fall off. As for Steve Watson, I could hardly bear to look at his expression. I sincerely apologized, sorry. Suddenly, Steve Watson's face brightened up, like a sunny day after a storm. He shook his paper fan happily and said, "Oh, I get it. Sorry, right? I hear that all the time on TV. But tell me, pretty girl, how do you know so much? Where are you from?" In an instant, all the embarrassment I felt vanished. I rolled my eyes and tried to hold back the urge to lose my temper. "From the great Tang of the East," I said sarcastically. "Where am I from, really?" Should I tell him that just yesterday, Linda and I were still living in the city center, in an expensive apartment? There was a little European-style balcony there, where I grew my favorite pothose plants. The wind would blow, and they would stretch longingly toward the south. Even though I hated drinking a glass of milk every day and despised the piano lessons the maid forced me to take, I loved the oversized plush toys taller than me, loved Linda's perfumes that left a mesmerizing scent, and loved the fancy restaurants Linda would take me to, where we could sit behind the large floor-to-ceiling windows and watch the city's twinkling lights. But last night, Linda came home and sat on the sofa, with tear marks still visible on her face. She said to me, "Alice, we're moving tomorrow." Honestly, even now, I haven't fully accepted that reality. So, without paying attention to Steve Watson, who was still fanning himself with his paper fan, frozen mid-motion in shock, I walked straight past him. After taking just 2 steps, I heard a middle-aged woman shouting, "You brat! How dare you waste the money your father got from returning the bottles? A bottle is worth 30 cents, and that's $8.70. You're a disgrace." I turned around and saw Steve Watson no longer look like the tough guy he pretended to be. Instead, he was grimacing as the woman pulled on his left ear. Seeing me looking, the woman immediately let go of his ear. Steve Watson, now embarrassed, quickly threw his paper fan on the ground and hid behind Wendy Watson, using her as a shield. Wendy Watson immediately shrieked in horror, her beautiful face twisted in shock. I couldn't help but burst out laughing, and that laugh only served to annoy Wendy Watson. She quickly stopped screaming, calmly applied some powder to her face, then gave me a haughty humph and swayed her hips as she walked away. By the 3rd evening, on my way back from buying soy sauce at shop number 1, I coincidentally ran into Steve Watson again. I tried to walk left, but he moved left. I tried to go right, but he moved right. Not wanting to deal with him, I asked, "What do you want?" Steve Watson, his eyes gleaming with gossip, smirked and asked, "Alice, I heard you guys used to be rich, is that true?" My heart skipped a beat. How did he know? Still, I pretended to be indifferent and asked, "Who said that?" "The young lady, of course, Wendy Watson." Steve Watson said, "She never steps out of the house, so what could she possibly know?" I nodded, "Oh, right. Linda's business went bankrupt, so we had to come here." "Liar." Steve Watson smugly said, "You were kicked out by rich people because one of you is a mistress, and the other is an orphan picked up from the street." Steve Watson's words were truly cruel, hitting right at my heart. My hands shook, and I accidentally spilled the entire jar of sauce onto him. "Don't you dare insult Linda. You ignorant fool." I angrily scolded him in Chinese. The result? Steve Watson not only understood, but understood perfectly well. "How could a boss like me endure such an insult?" he said, gritting his teeth. "Don't think you're all that just because you're a pretty girl. Don't think I won't hit you. Oh, I'm so scared." I clutched my chest, pretending to act frightened, then rolled my eyes and calmly walked past him without saying another word. Our hurried meeting tonight would probably lead to a major showdown tomorrow on Riverside Street, with cries and screams echoing all around. Steve Watson lived at number 38. Uncle Watson worked on the construction site of the Chinese Versailles Palace, carrying bricks and cement, while Aunt Watson helped out at the small restaurant at number 3. When the busy evening rush was over, the lady boss would head to the tea house to play cards, while Uncle Watson returned home to eat some fried peanuts and drink a bit of beer. Steve Watson, taking advantage of the adults' busyness, would lead a group of kids around, wandering everywhere, climbing hills to steal fruit, catching loaches in the river, or playing wild games in the fields. He had a blast. But after he gathered up some beer bottles and exchanged them for money, instead of doing anything useful, he went and made a paper fan. Feeling that his taste had suddenly become much more refined, he stopped running around the hills and instead started imitating a wealthy young master, strolling around like a charming playboy. Now that the paper fan was ruined, he no longer had the tool to attract naive little girls, so he focused all his attention on dealing with me. But I wasn't afraid of him at all. There's a saying that fits me perfectly: not afraid of the heavens, not afraid of the earth, just afraid of Linda saying nothing. Nowadays, the only person in the world who could make me afraid is probably Linda. Because, just as Steve Watson said, I really was an orphan from the orphanage. If it weren't for Linda, I don't dare imagine how much longer I would have had to endure that life. Linda, how did I meet her? That year, the orphanage where I lived had walls covered in grime, and the plaster had long since dried up and cracked into chunks, peeling off in the wind. The red wooden shutters were covered with a thick layer of dust. After being exposed to the sun and rain, they were warped and couldn't close properly anymore. On rainy days, the rain would leak in, and in winter, cold wind would howl through the gaps, sounding like the cries of a ghost. What was worse, at first, there were only small signs of water leakage in the four corners of the ceiling, like an old, dirty ink painting. But later, the situation got worse, and even on days when it wasn't raining, we could still be woken up suddenly by water dripping down. So we had to place pots and pans all over the room to catch the water, and the constant drip made it impossible to sleep through the night. Even at the lowest level, orphanages have their own divisions, categorized into different classes. I was only 5 years old that year, the youngest, and always a bit slow. In front of the caretakers, the other kids would act sweetly and kindly help me, offering me crayons, jumping rope with me, reading comic books together, sharing candy, and pushing me on the swings. But the moment the caretakers turned their backs, their true selves were revealed. They would scribble all over my sketchbook, the kids swinging the rope would intentionally trip me, they tore the comic books in front of me and accused me of ripping them, and they took back the candy they had given me, even taking the portion that was originally mine. When I was swinging, they would give me a hard push from behind. Every time they saw me getting scolded by the caretaker for ruining my new dress or not getting to eat, they were thrilled. They even wore a certain pitiful pride on their faces, looking down on me and saying, "You're not like us." As a naive child, I longed to be friends with them, constantly asking, "Why am I different? If I can change, I will. I'll change to be just like you so you can accept me." Those were the words I wanted to say, but before I could speak, they cut me off. Thankfully, at that time, they didn't give me the chance to say those words. They turned around, smugly saying, "We might meet our parents any day now, but you will never see yours again. Never again." I suddenly stood there, all alone. The setting sun cast its light on me and along the corridor. I watched them walk farther and farther away until, with a bang, they slammed the door shut. And then, I fell into darkness. Yes, I was different from the other orphans. I wasn't abandoned by my parents or kidnapped and unable to find my way home. My parents were gone. For the rest of my life, I would never see them again. Maybe it was because of them that I eventually learned to act obedient in front of adults, while deep inside, I developed a mischievous streak. Because only by doing that could I survive in this harsh place. And it was in that orphanage that I met Linda. The day before Linda came to the orphanage, we all received a notification. We knew that a beautiful woman was coming to adopt a child. She had a car, just like the ones you see on TV, the kind that could drive all the way up to the orphanage gates at the top of the hill. I hoped for a teddy bear, and lots of delicious food. And if there was a dress, that would be even better. Do you think there will be pretty dresses? Yes, yes. The caretakers told us there would be everything, and they wanted us to be good, take a bath, and wear clean clothes to greet the visitors the next day. Yes, and we're going to perform, too. Everyone was eagerly discussing it, but I remained expressionless. After all, if even they could look down on me, what right did I have to be chosen? Thank you for listening to the Painful Youth novel series The Summer Letter from Riverside Street, written by Lu Yan Ba Bok Du. This work is proudly presented by Swan Lu Van Hoa. Episode 2, that night, the caretakers were all busy setting up and cleaning, so they didn't have much energy to manage us. After the bedtime story, the caretaker closed the door and left, but a moment later, everyone was chatting, some were playing around, running circles around the house, and some even climbed out of the window. We ran out to the grass to play. Later, someone suggested playing hide-and-seek, and the idea was met with enthusiastic approval. Maybe because everyone believed that they would be the one chosen tomorrow, their moods were particularly good. Or perhaps the hope in my eyes was too obvious, so for the first time, they asked me, "Do you want to play?" I quickly nodded non-stop, afraid they would change their minds. They then said, "If you want to play, then follow us." So I followed them, climbing through the window, which was taller than me. During the process, due to my clumsiness, I became the target of their ridicule. They pointed at me and laughed, "Ha ha ha, look. She can't even climb through the window. What a fool." But I still managed to clumsily climb out, arriving at a new world I had never seen before, completely different from the bedroom. The moonlight gently spread its glow, and the stars shone brightly, low in the sky. Surrounding the grassy area were dense, broadleaf plants, layered and intertwined under the streetlights. It seemed as though if you reached out, you could grab a handful of sharp, green leaves. The thick foliage cast countless mottled shadows on our shoulders. "Do you know how to play hide-and-seek?" I shook my head. "Just find a place to hide and don't let anyone find you. If no one finds you, you mustn't come out. Then you'll win." I nodded. "Did you get it? If no one finds you, you can't come out on your own." I nodded again. The plants looked dark and eerie, like the forbidden forest at Hogwarts, a place everyone avoided. But when it was my turn to hide, I eagerly went towards it. I crouched down deep in the bushes, curling up like a little mushroom. I waited, thinking that when they found me, I would rise and become the winner. I believed they would come to find me. I kept squatting there, waiting and waiting. But the wait felt endlessly long. The sound of cicadas ebbed and flowed like waves crashing and retreating. The air carried the lingering coolness of the night. My legs had long since gone numb from squatting, and my bare arms were covered in small bumps from mosquito bites. Yet no one came to find me. I had been forgotten by them. Eventually, it was the caretaker who, during breakfast roll call, noticed that someone was missing and rushed to find me. By that time, it was only an hour before Linda would arrive. The other children had already changed into their cleanest clothes, standing in two neat lines, their heads bowed obediently but their eyes full of anticipation, waiting for Linda's arrival. As for me, the caretaker was annoyed, thinking I was always causing trouble at the most important times, making them incredibly frustrated. So, with an irritated expression, she said, "Go back to the bedroom and stay there. Don't come out again. We don't need you causing more trouble and making our guests unhappy." In the hall, there were laughter and cheerful voices. I initially planned to behave and stay in the room, not to step out again. But eventually, hunger got the better of me, and I sneaked into the kitchen in search of food. The kitchen was empty, and in the big pot, there were only 2 steamed buns left. The buns had long lost their warmth, cold and hard like bricks. But I didn't have the ability to despise them at all, not even when the buns suddenly slipped from my hands, rolling a few times on the floor. I hurriedly tried to grab them, only to fall to the ground. In my line of sight, the hem of a lotus-colored embroidered dress appeared, revealing long legs and perfectly balanced knees. As I slowly raised my head, I saw Linda standing in the doorway. Linda examined me for a moment, then lazily raised her chin and asked the orphanage director, "Who is this?" The caretaker, terrified that my appearance would disgust Linda, quickly turned to scold me, "Why did you come out looking like this? Didn't I tell you to stay in your room? What if you scare the guests?" Saying this, she roughly grabbed me like picking up a piece of trash, dragging me away. But after only 2 steps, I heard Linda give a command, "This one is fine. She seems to catch my eye." Still holding on to me, the caretaker immediately let go, turning around as if to say something, perhaps to explain that I was mischievous and disobedient, and it would be better to choose another child. But before she could say anything, Linda silenced her with a cold, indifferent look. Linda walked up to me without looking at the caretaker, and in a gentle, playful tone, asked me, "What's your name?" I timidly replied, "Alice." Linda softly repeated, "Alice." Standing in the sunlight, Linda narrowed her eyes, bent down to get closer to me, and reached out her hand. "Alice, I'll take you home." In that moment, the feeling Linda gave me could only be described by the phrase, "a smile that could topple a city." Her bright eyes and shining teeth were like stars falling from the sky, all landing in her gaze. Linda was slender, even her knuckles were delicate. But when she held my hand, it felt as though she had placed a warm sun in my palm, melting away my loneliness and fear of the dark. My sadness dissolved instantly. I let her hold my hand as I carefully followed the elegant hem of her dress. I don't have many fond memories of the orphanage, but I will never forget that day when I left with Linda. As the car drove away, I saw them standing there, waving vigorously at me, calling out, "Goodbye, goodbye." Even when the car had gone far, they were still there, watching me leave, like a silent image in the distance. But their faces, their expressions, their names, everything about them, disappeared from my heart and mind the moment Linda chose me. They faded into an endless void, as if they had never existed. I hated that place, with its high walls where the sun never shone. I hated the caretakers, who were impossible to trust. I hated the other children who loved to tease me. I hated the patched-up clothes, the hands that could never get clean, and the buns harder than bricks. But what I hated most was when they surrounded me, clapping and chanting, "Oh, oh, the orphan whose parents are all dead. Oh, oh, poor child." As the car drove further, I slowly turned away, leaving behind the fading shadows, stretching longer and longer until they disappeared completely. It was like a dream. No, I'm not pitiful. My tomorrow will be fresh and bright. Goodbye means never seeing each other again, because Linda treated me very well. So, I grew up obedient and gentle, just as she wanted. But now, Linda has a lot of things to deal with in Laitan and is often not in Riverside Street, so I no longer have to pretend to be so well behaved. Especially when there are people like Steve Watson around. He caught a large centipede from the field and placed it in front of me, causing me to scream and run away. In my panic, I fell into a foul, thick ditch nearby, and he laughed uncontrollably. But with just a box of chocolate, I easily won over some of the younger kids, who climbed onto the roof and blocked the chimney of Luke's house with rocks. If Steve Watson tried to boil water, he was in for trouble. That night, I lay in the courtyard of house number 23, cooling off. The moonlight was like water, and a soft fragrance filled the air. I fell asleep without realizing it. When I awoke from a dream, I vaguely saw someone climbing over the wall in the moonlight. He patted my head twice and muttered, "This watermelon is good, it's ripe." Panicked, I saw him pull out a kitchen knife, swinging it toward my head. I couldn't dodge, and I felt like I was about to see blood splatter. But the knife only brushed softly against my hair, cutting a few strands. Buddy bit the man, snapping me out of my shock. I scrambled to turn on the light, and in the dim glow, I saw Steve Watson, holding a paper kitchen knife painted black. In the moonlight, it looked real enough to fool someone. I was furious. Of all the pranks, why this one? How dare he toy with me? Like a dormant volcano, I exploded, swearing to take my revenge on him. Because Linda had too many things to handle and couldn't fully trust me at this age, 7 years old, a difficult stage to manage, she eventually entrusted me to Aunt Watson, who washed dishes at the small restaurant at number 3. That way, after lunch, I could stay there and watch TV until she returned. When Linda asked Aunt Watson, she immediately agreed and even gave me a chicken wing to eat. She said, "I've always wanted a daughter like Alice, not a mischievous boy like Non Non, who's like a wild monkey I can't control." I bowed my head, hiding my satisfaction, and nibbled on the chicken wing, feeling the joy spreading inside me. By then, it was almost September, and I would soon start school at a nearby elementary school on Riverside Street. Linda gave me a brown notebook, but I liked the colorful, scented notebooks in the stationery shop at number 16 much more. But we were different now, so I didn't dare tell her. I just knew that when the notebook was used up, I could replace it with a new one. One day, while Steve Watson was also at the restaurant watching the 1983 version of The Legend of the Condor Heroes, I secretly used a large pair of scissors to cut the notebook into pieces. Linda returned and asked what was going on. I didn't hesitate for a second, pointing at Steve Watson, who was still grinning foolishly at the TV. It was him who cut it. Steve Watson, finally realizing what was happening, quickly protested, "No way, it was you who cut it. You cut it, you cut it." Seeing the argument going nowhere, I pouted, tears welling up, "It was you who used the big scissors on the table to cut it." It was a poorly constructed lie, lacking any finesse, yet someone believed it. Aunt Watson came out of the kitchen, grabbed a broom, and gave Steve Watson a good beating. "You brat. Not only do you not admit it, but you also dare to blame Alice." After all the chaos, I ended up with a new notebook. One day, the entire Riverside Street lost power. On such scorching summer nights, Steve Watson, now a first grader, stood in front of a fan that wouldn't spin, singing the song about a big windmill. "The windmill turns and turns, the scenery here is beautiful." But the fan didn't start spinning, and finally, he shouted that he wanted to go swimming at the reservoir. Aunt Watson asked me, "Alice, are you hot? Want a non to take you swimming? If you don't know how, he can teach you." Honestly, I was terrified of the water, too scared to get in, but my mischievous mind was already at work. I just wanted to mess with Steve Watson, seeing him standing behind his mom with that frustrated expression but unable to show his anger. It was pure satisfaction. So, I closed my workbook, raised my head, and smiled sweetly, "Sure, Auntie." At the reservoir, many people were already splashing around in the water. Steve Watson, as restless as ever, rolled up his pants, stood in the shallow water, and splashed some water at me, excitedly shouting, "Alice, come on. I'll teach you how to swim." I shrugged it off and continued my walk around the shore, the scorching sun beating down on me. I silently clung to the belief that a calm mind brings coolness, fooling myself that the bare reservoir's banks were lined with cooling green trees. After 2 hours, my throat was dry, so I yelled to Steve Watson, "Steve Watson, I want some ice cream now." By this time, Steve Watson and his buddies had swum across to the other side of the reservoir. He lifted his head from the water, wiped his wet face, and angrily shouted back, "Go get it yourself." Not wanting to lose face in front of his friends, Steve Watson immediately refused me, not doing it. I snorted and smirked, "Fine, then I'll go tell your mom. I'll tell her you were flirting with girls instead of teaching me to swim. Let's see how she deals with you." Steve Watson shouted back, "You didn't even want to learn." I shot back, "You didn't even teach." And I added casually, let's see if your mom believes you or me. Steve Watson's face twisted in frustration, like someone with constipation. Under the pressure, he finally swam back, got out of the water, and went to buy me an ice cream. By the time he brought it back, the ice cream had started to melt a little, but I licked it happily and praised him, good boy, I'll reward you with a bone later. Steve Watson snapped back, I'm not your dog. Perhaps I had used the Aunt Watson technique too frequently and too effectively, and after being oppressed for too long, Steve Watson finally couldn't take it anymore and decided to rebel. Although the outcomes of his rebellion were unexpected by everyone. During the transformation of my relationship with Steve Watson from quantitative to qualitative, two incidents played an indelible role. The first event happened on a Saturday when I finally had a break from school and took a pleasant afternoon nap. When I woke up, I couldn't find Buddy anywhere. After circling Riverside Street 3 times searching, Steve Watson leisurely stopped me and said, "You want Buddy? If you do, come to the back hill at 8 p.m. By now, Steve Watson was a head taller than me. I looked up, clasped my hands behind my back, and said clearly, if I'm afraid of you, I'm not Alice. Satisfied, Steve Watson replied, good. He then marched off, leading his gang with swagger. At 8 p.m., I arrived at the agreed-upon spot behind the hill. But as I passed house number 17, I started to panic. Grandma Smith, who lived at number 17, had passed away a few days ago, and her body was still placed in the main hall. There were wreaths lined up at the door. As I walked by, the door was open, and the dim yellow light shone on a black and white portrait, casting an eerie atmosphere. The black wooden coffin was barely visible, and the entire hall was empty. Cold sweat soaked my back, and I hesitated for a moment before closing my eyes and running quickly past. I faintly heard laughter behind me, but I didn't dare look back. Even in daylight, the back hill was just a small mound, and as I walked through a large orchard, I saw a vast field of green crops stretching to the horizon. However, the crickets were chirping so loudly it made me uneasy. In the distance, a few faint blue and purple flames flickered between the trees, their shadows swaying in the wind, creating a terrifying scene. I walked cautiously, looking for Buddy. Finally, I found him tied to a large tree, but for some reason, he was fast asleep. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't wake him. I climbed onto a small mound to untie the rope, but just then, Steve Watson appeared, draped in a mosquito net and holding a feather duster, pretending to be the white ghost to scare me. Already shaken by Grandma Smith's death, I screamed in terror. In the next moment, I lost my balance and tumbled down the small mound, rolling several times before hitting my forehead on a horizontal log, leaving me dizzy. Steve Watson's gang quickly shone their flashlights on me, but they just stood there, exchanging glances without saying a word. In the faint light, I saw a small puddle of blood on the grass. Dazed, I tried to get up, confused about which direction was which, and asked, "What's going on?" Steve Watson stammered, "Alice, your forehead." But he couldn't finish his sentence. I struggled to stand up, trying to act like a heroine, planning to carry Buddy home, but the blood from my forehead kept flowing, non-stop. No matter how much I wiped, I couldn't clean it off. Steve Watson's face turned pale, and after hesitating for a moment, he handed Buddy over to one of the kids and turned his back to me, leaning on his knees in a strange posture. "What are you doing?" I asked, while wiping the blood and stumbling toward him. But my foot slipped, and I almost crashed straight into him. Luckily, in a panic, he reached out and grabbed my shoulders tightly. Under the faint moonlight, Steve Watson lifted his face, full of righteous resolve, and said, "Get on my back, hurry." I hesitated, but he added, "If you're late, you'll get a scar." That sentence had an immediate effect. Without hesitation, I climbed onto his back, and he immediately started running like a brave knight. At first, he carried me steadily and properly, but after going up and down the hill for a while, he began to struggle. So, from time to time, he tossed me into the air like a sack of rice and caught me again. His movements became more frequent, and his steps slowed, but he never shouted at me like he usually did. When we arrived at the health clinic, there was only one female doctor in a white coat. She looked at the small piece of skin on my forehead that had peeled up, then took out some red disinfectant and a cotton swab to clean the wound. I screamed in pain, "Ouch, ouch. Doctor, can you be more gentle?" The doctor replied, "If I'm gentle, your hair won't grow back." I was trying to figure out if she was telling the truth or just scaring me when Linda arrived, having been notified by one of Steve Watson's followers. Seeing the blood still streaming down my face, Linda gasped, "Oh my God," and quickly rushed over, gently wiping away the blood with a damp towel. I tried hard to endure it, but I still showed signs of pain. Linda immediately caressed my head, her eyes filled with tears, as if they were about to spill out at any moment. She comforted me softly, "Alice, be brave, it'll be over soon. Just hold on a little longer." I threw myself into her arms, feeling utterly wronged. Mom. How long had it been since I was this close to Linda? At first, she treated me very well, never letting me lack for food or clothes. But later on, she suddenly changed. She didn't want to see me as much, and I rarely saw her smile. It was as if she was a puppet whose strings had been cut, empty and lifeless. Yes, there was no one pulling her strings anymore, because she had met a man who held some kind of dark charm over her. But even so, I had followed Linda wholeheartedly, from Laiton to Riverside Street. I had no parents, and Linda was my closest family. No one in this world treated me like she did. No matter what, I would always stay by her side, never leaving, because I knew Linda still loved me. For example, right now, she anxiously asked the doctor, "Will that spot really not grow hair again?" She's a girl, how can that be? With an adult present, the doctor gave a vague response, "It depends on how well she heals." Linda grew more worried and was about to say something else when someone else walked into the clinic. It was Uncle Watson. His face was like a storm gathering, full of dark clouds and rage, looking terrifying. As soon as Uncle Watson stepped over the threshold, Steve Watson, who usually acted so arrogant, immediately became timid, bowing his head and stammering as he explained the situation. He hesitantly pointed at me, my forehead wrapped in multiple layers of gauze. The next second, Uncle Watson's expression turned fierce. He shot a glare at Steve Watson, grabbed a nearby broom, and shouted, "You brat! Causing trouble again. Have you had enough of life? Kneel down." With a loud thud, Steve Watson dropped to his knees instantly. Uncle Watson, still fuming with rage, raised the broom and started beating him. "You're so grown up, yet still so irresponsible. You don't know your limits. All you do is play and play. Today, I might as well beat you to death, you good for nothing." Despite the beating, Steve Watson kept his tough guy demeanor, gritting his teeth and clenching his fists, refusing to make a sound. At first, I watched him get hit and found it satisfying. I thought that, of course, parents would protect their children, and Uncle Watson was just putting on a show for Linda. But gradually, I noticed something was wrong. That day, Steve Watson was wearing a white tank top, and after a while, spots of blood started seeping through. Panic set in, and I shouted, "Wait!" In doing so, I scrunched my face in pain from my wound, but I still managed to get out of bed, hobbling over to plead with Uncle Watson, "Uncle, please forgive Steve Watson this time. He won't dare do it again, I swear." Uncle Watson gently pushed my hand away and said, "No, Alice. You don't need to plead for this brat. Today, I'll teach him a lesson so he won't bully you again." Seeing Uncle Watson raise the broom again, I burst into tears, putting on my best Oscar-worthy performance. While crying, I clung to Uncle Watson's arm. "Uncle, please stop. If you don't stop, I'll feel terrible, and if I feel terrible, my wound won't heal." Uncle Watson, unable to bear the commotion, looked at the stubborn Steve Watson, sighed, and finally lowered the broom. Steve Watson kept his head down, his bangs covering most of his face. I couldn't see his expression. Afterwards, I went home with Linda and fell asleep from exhaustion. The next morning, I was pulled out of a lingering dream by the faint but persistent sound of knocking outside my window. I opened the window and peeked out, only to see Steve Watson had climbed over the wall again. Seeing my head appear, he started tossing wet wild chrysanthemums up to my window, throwing them over and over until I caught them. Only then did he break into a smile. After I received the bouquet, he just stood there, silently watching me. After a long while, he quietly said, "Alice, I'm sorry." He mumbled something else, but I couldn't hear it clearly. When I asked him to repeat, Steve Watson blushed, fidgeted, and then shouted loudly, "Don't worry, I'll take responsibility." I stared blankly at him holding the bouquet of wild chrysanthemums and then watched as Steve Watson dashed away like the wind. I couldn't make sense of anything, so I went back and grabbed a bottle of mineral water, cut it open, and placed the wild chrysanthemums in the water. It felt like we had signed a peaceful coexistence treaty, and suddenly Steve Watson and I became good friends. We could walk to and from school together, greet each other with "hi," and say "bye" when we parted. We even exchanged homework and hung out together. By then, it was the height of summer in July, with green everywhere. Since I had never seen someone catch loaches, Steve Watson actually took me to a paddy field. We divided the areas, he stood in the upper part, and I was in the lower part. Between the two paddy fields was a small ditch, not too deep, with red waterweeds, purple water flowers, and blue algae dotting the surface, reflecting the sky above. We took off our shoes and placed them on the bank, rolled up our pants, and stepped into the soft mud of the ditch. The two of us leaned in close, peering at the scenery beneath the water. Steve Watson demonstrated how to catch loaches. Loaches are actually easy to catch. Just find where their holes are, plunge your hands deep in, scoop up a handful of mud, and voila, the little guys will be wriggling in your hands, begging for mercy. Steve Watson was a good kid. On such a hot day, he really brought me out here just because I said, "I've never seen anyone catch loaches." Maybe it was because I had been in the sun too long and felt a bit dizzy, or maybe there were so few boys on Riverside Street that my standards for beauty had dropped a few levels. For a moment, I suddenly thought Steve Watson looked quite handsome from the side. The sunlight cast a halo around his profile, making it hard for me to look away. A moment later, I snapped back to reality and hurriedly slapped away a bug clinging to my leg, watching sadly as a red welt appeared. I moved a few meters away from Steve Watson to a safer distance. Out of nowhere, Steve Watson called out, "Alice." Startled and a little unsettled, I replied, "Huh," and looked in his direction. He said, "Come over here." "Why?" I asked, feeling suspicious. "I'll show you some tadpoles." "Sure." Afraid I'd miss out on something fun, I eagerly agreed with a grin. I measured the distance of the ditch and got ready to jump across. I took a big step, leaping through the air. Perfect. But as beautiful as the idea was, reality was cruel. I had misjudged or overestimated my abilities, and I ended up getting stuck between the two paddy fields, face-planting into the ditch. Steve Watson was so shocked that it took him 5 seconds to recover and rush over to pull me out. I was miserable, my face contorted in frustration. Steve Watson stood there for a moment, then burst out laughing. Furious, I stomped my foot. "I want to take a bath. I don't want to see any tadpoles, I want to go home." Steve Watson said, "Okay," and then suddenly slapped his forehead. "Oh no. What's wrong?" I asked. "The loaches, they all slipped back into the field," he said dejectedly. At this moment, I couldn't care less. Forget it, I don't want it anymore," I said, and Steve Watson nodded in agreement. "Yeah, after all, we caught a big loach today." Steve Watson, has anyone ever told you that you're really annoying? When I returned home, dirty and worried that Linda would scold me, I found that the house at number 23 was still empty. Recently, Linda had been leaving early and coming home late every day. When she got back, she would lie on the sofa and drink a lot of beer, drinking until she threw up all over the place. Once she felt better, she would start crying again, mumbling, "Why? Why are you doing this to me? Why won't you see me?" Her voice sounded so mournful and pitiful in the night. I didn't know how to comfort her, but I remembered that day clearly. It was the last time that man came to our house. It was the first time I heard him call Linda by her full name. He threw a stack of papers in her face and said, "Ngwen. Tan. I always thought you were pure, unlike other women who play games. Humph, turns out you're the most scheming of them all. You've been lying to me for so long that I can't believe it. Don't ever show up in front of me again. I'll never see you again." And at that moment, I saw the lowest, most humiliated version of Linda. She actually hugged his leg. The man hesitated for a moment, then immediately shook her off. Linda, who was always so indifferent and nonchalant, suddenly crawled on her hands and knees, grabbing his leg again, crying and begging, "Don't leave, please. Don't leave. It's my fault, give me another chance." But the man still walked away without looking back, slamming the door behind him. Linda rushed after him. Outside, the rain was pouring down. I waited for a long time, until sleep overtook me, and I collapsed on the sofa. When Linda finally came back, I opened the door. She was leaning against the wall, drenched, with strands of hair clinging to her forehead. She looked at me without saying a word, her eyes void of tears, filled only with the smell of alcohol. I wrung out a towel and handed it to her. She took it and covered her face, as if she had fallen asleep. But suddenly, she jumped up and rushed to the bathroom. The faucet gushed with water, but even through the sound of it, I could clearly hear Linda sobbing, crying her heart out. These days, Linda came home later and later, drank more, and cried more pitifully each time. But there was nothing I could do. I realized that I had finally become a burden to her. I couldn't help Linda with anything. All I could do was take care of myself when she wasn't home. And I was right. Linda didn't come home for 2 days straight. I didn't dare go to the little restaurant to eat, afraid that people would find out I couldn't afford to pay, and then they'd pity me. The thing I hate most in life is people's pity. I didn't want to tell the landlady, "When Linda comes back, we'll pay you." Because I was afraid Linda wouldn't come back. If she didn't come back, I wouldn't have the money to pay. I had become a liar and a child abandoned by Linda. And so the vicious cycle continued. They pitied me again, so I quietly sat at the door, staring at the moon, waiting alone and determined for Linda to return. But on the third day, Linda still hadn't come back. I struggled to get through the night. My stomach was growling, so I gulped down a large bowl of cold water, telling myself to just fall asleep. If I slept, I wouldn't feel hungry. But I was already so hungry, the kind of hunger that twisted my stomach and wouldn't let me sleep. Too hungry, I rushed from my bedroom to the empty kitchen, sighing in despair. The room was dim and blurry, with only a faint light filtering in through the window. After thinking for a long time, I fumbled to put on my clothes, opened the door, and stepped outside. The cold night bit at me as I closed the door to number 23 and took a walk down the street. Number 1, on Riverside Street, was a small convenience store run by an old lady. It had lots of jars filled with colorful candies. Whenever I passed by, I would obediently greet her, "Hello, Grandma." She was always kind, often stuffing a handful of hawthorn berries or red dates into my pocket, reminding me, "Don't let the other kids on Riverside Street see." Later on, after we got to know each other better, I would occasionally sit with her. She sat in her rocking chair, holding an old Bible in her hands, peacefully reading out passages to me. Grandma lived a simple and devout life as a Christian. She could open the Bible to any page and immediately recite the Gospel and chapter from memory. She not only prayed every night before bed, but every Tuesday evening, she would take the bus to a small church in the city to pray. Grandma was always good to me. But at this moment, nothing could surpass my hunger. Not even God could save me. My hand reached for the shriveled but delicious dried figs. But just as I was about to grab them, there was a sudden knock at the door. "Grandma, why didn't you go to church today?" the voice asked. Then another knock. "Grandma, I want to buy a pack of cigarettes." I covered my mouth, not daring to make a sound, even holding my breath, afraid they would discover I was there. Strange, there's no one inside, but there's a candle lit. Perhaps they peeked through the door and saw that no one was inside, so they left. What I hid from the old lady was that back in the orphanage, the caregivers would often read the Bible to us. I had also sincerely prayed to God, asking them not to bully me anymore. But I was still frequently left alone, without anyone to help. So, I had already learned that there is no God in this world, and no one will save you, except yourself. The old lady had to lean most of her body weight on my arms just to slowly stand up. I quickly grabbed the bag of dried figs, turned, and jumped through the window to escape. But perhaps I was too hasty, for when I turned, I knocked something over with a loud bang. Without looking back, I leaped out. The night sky was boundless, and I took a deep breath of fresh air as I hopped back to number 23. It was early morning, the air cold and fresh. I had eaten my fill and slept comfortably, but the noise woke me up. I looked out and saw flames raging everywhere, burning at full force. The bright yellow fire raged uncontrollably, destroying everything in its path. Heat and thick smoke billowed everywhere, and houses crumbled in a series of crashes. Crackling noises filled the air as the wind picked up, causing the flames to leap several meters high. The fire blazed with terrifying beauty, and the sky was strangely lit in shades of orange-red. People were running down the street, screaming, "Fire! Hurry, help put out the fire!" Others, not fully dressed, rushed out with buckets of water or clutched heavy bags. I quickly slipped on my sandals and ran out into the street. By the time the fire was put out, the entire row of shops along the old lady's store had been reduced to rubble, with only charred remnants left behind. The old lady was in tears, and people kept comforting her, while angrily vowing to find out who had caused this. Conversations buzzed around me, everyone talking at once. My whole body was cold, yet I couldn't stop sweating. I was terrified that my panicked expression would give away that I was the culprit, so I quickly turned and ran back to number 23. At this point, number 23 was the only place where I felt safe. I ran in the wind, but it felt like the street had no end, filled with fear. The only thought in my mind was, "Don't catch me, don't catch me. I didn't mean to do it. Don't catch me." When I reached the door of number 23, I was surprised to see Steve Watson, wearing only a single tank top, pacing under the rose wall. It seemed like he had an urge to repeat his old trick of climbing over the wall, but there were too many people passing by, so he just paced back and forth, occasionally glancing up at my window. As soon as Steve Watson saw me, he rushed over and hugged me tightly, his voice filled with relief and joy. "Alice, I couldn't find you earlier, I was scared to death." I let my head droop onto his shoulder, unable to speak the truth, and could only say, "Steve Watson, I'm so tired. Can I lean on you?" Steve Watson generously patted his other shoulder. "It's okay, lean on me, I can handle it." But in the end, Steve Watson couldn't hold me up. I collapsed and ended up falling ill. 3 days later, the whole neighborhood was buzzing about a big piece of street news. It had nothing to do with the arsonist. The news was much fresher. A developer from a nearby construction site had gotten wind of it and wanted to buy the land here. The developer's representatives, like tides of squid, kept coming in waves. Many people considered it a blessing in disguise and were overjoyed. When Steve Watson came to see me, it was the first time he formally entered through the gate of number 23. He stood in the courtyard, while I stood on the steps a few paces away. He looked up at me deeply. At that moment, the sky was gray, and rain kept falling. The frogs in the fields croaked endlessly, and a TV blared from some nearby house, impatiently buzzing with noise. After a long while, he finally spoke and called my name, Alice. I'm moving. His smile was a bit forced. I was stunned for a moment, then laughed carelessly, congratulations. It turned out that Uncle Watson had stopped playing the lottery and had sold several rundown shops, receiving a large compensation. Overnight, they had become rich. He asked, "Is there anything you want to say?" I tilted my head, thinking seriously, and replied, "No." His smile finally faded. "All right, then I'm leaving." He took 2 steps, then quickly turned around, looking incredibly serious. "Alice, wait for me." For a long time, I couldn't find my voice, so I simply nodded. Satisfied, Steve Watson left. I quickly ran up to the 2nd floor and looked out of the window. In the distance, I could see the lush green fields, the reddened soil, and the winding paths. A truck drove through the mud, eventually disappearing at the end of the street. It felt as if the whole world was sinking under the heavy sky, and the rain kept pouring down harder. After Steve Watson's family moved away, many others gradually left Shuyan Street too. But no matter what, Linda refused to leave, even for double the price. It was just the 2 of us, stubbornly staying on this desolate street, day after day, year after year. Little did I know, I would meet Steve Watson again at my new school, S High. 2nd letter, S High School, Class 1H. He was like that flower pinned at the collar of spring. It was September, the time when seniors flirted with juniors, juniors flirted with seniors, and the older girls fancied the younger boys, while the younger boys tried to cozy up to the older girls. It was the opening ceremony. The host was a new first-year girl. Her hair, slightly messy, made her small, sweet face stand out even more. On the first day of school, the new students didn't have uniforms yet. She was casually dressed in a white t-shirt and a short floral chiffon skirt but still drew plenty of attention. Her Mandarin was quite standard, not as perfect as a TV host, but her soft voice made everything she said sound pleasant. Even the dull ceremony became enjoyable to listen to. After she finished reading the opening speech for the donation ceremony, a middle-aged man stood up from the right side of the first row, leading the applause. He smiled gently, revealing 2 dimples. The middle-aged man was a well-known businessman in S City and had donated a large sum of money to the school. If it weren't for his deep love for his talented son who attended this school, he certainly wouldn't have participated in such events. As per the usual speech format, he talked about the past, the present, and future aspirations. He said, "To be honest, when I was young, I could barely read or write. Back then, when we were the poorest, I had to wash up in public restrooms. Then, one day, luck smiled on me, I found 10 yuan on the street. I immediately ran to a small restaurant and ate a bowl of egg fried rice. With the leftover money, I figured I could buy a lottery ticket, so I did. And guess what? I won 2nd prize. That's how I got the capital to start my business. Otherwise, I wouldn't have achieved what I have today. So, I hope Vuai studies hard. Knowledge is your capital. Don't repeat my path. Vuai, I'm proud of you." His recollection was especially touching, and the audience applauded vigorously. But at that moment, it felt like there was a train in my head, racing forward, pulling my memories along with it. The entire world went silent. What snapped me back to reality was the moral education director, who came over and asked, "Student 2, are you ready? You're next to go on stage." I suddenly remembered that I was the scholarship recipient and had to go on stage to accept the award and give a speech. Moreover, because of his status, I would also have to take a picture with him and be interviewed by the press. I walked up to the standing microphone. Below me, hundreds of people stood neatly. Being elevated above them made me extremely uncomfortable, as if I were back in the orphanage years ago, feeling isolated and helpless. It tore open my old wounds, piece by piece. They probably thought that what they gave me was well-deserved and that they had every right to feel proud and superior. Without causing a scene or drawing sympathy, they could easily obtain what they wanted. On the other hand, Vu came from such a good background, causing envy, while I lived at the very bottom of society, quietly just surviving. My existence only made others feel secure and satisfied. Suddenly, my mind went blank. The once quiet students began to whisper among themselves. My eyes stared blankly at the speech paper, but the words blurred before me. My gaze wandered down to Vu Ai's father. When our eyes met, he politely waved his hand. I clenched my fist tighter, staring at him, the man the newspapers praised as a successful person, with labels of excellence. The mole on the corner of his mouth grew larger and blurrier in my eyes. I gripped the microphone, and my voice echoed through the speakers. Before I was 5 years old, I was a very happy little girl. My dad loved me, and my mom adored me. I was their little treasure. Every day, my mom would make delicious meals for me, and when I ate them clean, she was so happy. She would choose pretty and comfortable clothes for me, dressing me up like a little princess. She bought me many dolls and books, teaching me to read letters and telling me wonderful fairy tales. And my dad, with his bearded chin. It made me feel ticklish. My father would laugh heartily too. He would toss me up into the air and catch me, then toss me up again and catch me again. He'd put me on his shoulders, and I'd shout, "Go, horsey, go." He would carry me, running around the living room, while Mom, carrying dishes from the kitchen, would stand nearby, smiling indulgently. But all those beautiful moments ended one day when I was 5. It was early spring, the white magnolias by the window were in full bloom, and a light drizzle had just fallen. The city lights, blurred by the misty rain, looked especially beautiful. The magnolias, drenched in rain, were filled with a fresh fragrance. The streetlights were warm, like little towns glowing with dew. Inside the house, I was hiding in the wardrobe, playing hide-and-seek, clutching my growling stomach, afraid to make a sound. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. My parents were lying on the cold floor, blood slowly flowing from beneath them, forming a trickling stream that crept toward the door. I realized my voice was trembling, on the verge of breaking into sobs, but I couldn't speak. Because all of this was the source of my deepest pain. After losing my parents, I tried hard not to think of them, choosing to avoid memories of them, fearing that reopening those memories would tear open raw, bleeding wounds. Now, at this moment, I truly had lost the ability to speak. The wet spots on my speech paper made the words blur, smudging line after line. I looked up and realized it was raining. Summer rains always came fiercely. The principal quickly grabbed the microphone and announced the end of the opening ceremony. The crowd instantly scattered, rushing to safe spots. But I, like someone recovering from a serious illness, felt weak, barely able to take a step. The sound of the rain kept ringing in my ears, lingering and unshakable. A moment later, someone held a dark blue plaid umbrella over my head. I turned my head and saw that it was Richard Stone, who had just stood so proudly on stage. He stood there like a tall, slender birch tree, one hand in his pocket, the other holding the umbrella. He kept a polite 2-step distance between us, but courteously tilted the umbrella to cover more of my side. His face looked a little sad, and I felt infected by that sadness. I watched as he slightly raised his head, revealing the elegant curve of his neck. Is the sky crying? Ah, yes, the sky is crying. I mimicked him, raising my head to look at the sky. The sky really is crying very sorrowfully. Yeah, it looks a lot better now. He suddenly turned his head to stare at my face, his expression changing, then he smiled softly. Huh. I didn't quite understand him. When you tilt your head like that, the tears won't fall. He pointed at my eyes, then carefully asked, so, are you still sad now? Am I still sad now? No, I was just surprised. Why could he tell the difference between my tears and the rain? Why could he so easily see through my sadness? Why did he come to stay by my side? Why would he care about someone with such a poor background like me? Why? 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 Sensing my unwavering gaze, Richard Stone slightly turned his head and gave me a polite smile. The corners of his lips were filled with delicate warmth, like a flower pinned to his collar, blooming in my eyes. Alice, shall we go back to the classroom? He asked. I dumbly nodded and followed him as we ran. In that moment, my sickly and bleak world suddenly brightened, as if a radiant light had pierced through the clouds. All I wanted was to grasp the smallest sliver of light in this world. In my memory, we shared an umbrella and ran through the rain. The surroundings were nothing but an empty playground. It wasn't a scene that would make anyone's heart race, nor was it a dangerous moment. But somehow, like this sudden rain, a feeling bloomed in my heart. It was as if all the flowers inside me had blossomed in an instant. Back in the classroom, the homeroom teacher asked each of us to introduce ourselves and shared some thoughts for the next 3 years, emphasizing once more the school rules and values. By the time everyone was seated, it was already time for the break. I was seated near the window, a perfect spot for cheating or skipping class. As I was enjoying my little victory, a girl sitting by the window turned around, her face flushed red, and called out, Alice, someone's here to see you. Before she could finish, someone had already propped himself up on the windowsill and lightly jumped into the classroom, causing the girls to scream. My seatmate was a chubby boy. Yes, every class has a jolly chubby kid. During his self-introduction, he said his favorite foods were chocolate and ice cream, his favorite activities were yawning and stretching, and his biggest dream was to be a koala in his next life, sleeping for 20 hours, eating for 2, and daydreaming for the remaining 2. The perfect life, he declared. I wanted to suggest that he consider being a national treasure in his next life, just sitting around, acting cute, and the rounder he got, the more people would love him. But I didn't dare say it because apparently, everyone liked him, not just because he was funny, but also because he consistently ranked in the top 5 of the class. At that moment, he grabbed me, surprised and excited, and asked, Alice, do you know him? I was just about to say no, planning to hide behind a book and escape, but before I could, the boy who had apparently become the prince of the school since day 1 was already at my desk. Caught in my panic, I didn't know what to say. But then, he casually responded, while still resting his hand on the windowsill behind me. I'm here to get my umbrella back. Huh. My jaw dropped. That checkered umbrella was clearly mine. I lent it to Richard Stone earlier. He kept one hand in his pocket and, with his right index finger, hooked the handle of the umbrella, ready to leave. Wait. I quickly stopped him. Are you saying, that umbrella was yours, and you gave it to Richard Stone? What do you think? He replied with a smug hum, his proud nose almost pointing at the ceiling. I understood. So, Richard Stone didn't come to find me voluntarily, he was just asked by him to do it. Yet I suddenly remembered what Richard Stone said, is the sky crying? Are you still sad now? Just like how some girls get completely captivated by a single line in a movie, I was deeply moved by those 2 sentences, like a flash of lightning. Unaware of my internal whirlwind, Steve Watson continued, narcissistically, hey, I'm in Class C. If you need anything, just come find me there. He had barely walked a couple of steps when he seemed to recall something and exclaimed, as if he'd just had an epiphany, oh, and there's something I've been meaning to do but kept forgetting. My mind was still stuck on Richard Stone's words, so I foolishly asked, what is it? He turned around, walked back, gently placed his hand on my shoulder, and suddenly hugged me. Just as I was about to push him away, he leaned in close and whispered, so only I could hear, Alice, I missed you." I was touched for a moment, my nose stung, and my eyes reddened. Then I shoved him away. "Miss your sister." Being hugged in public, and by someone known as the campus heartthrob, no less. How would I explain this to his fan club? Even if I tried to say we were just passing acquaintances like Ms. Gia and Soy Sauce Soldier, no one would believe me. Not even I could believe it. I could jump into the Yellow River or the Milky Way, and it still wouldn't wash off. And I had been played. Steve Watson had definitely done it on purpose. Sure enough, he left with a smug smile on his face. Look at his retreating back, it was just like a wolf with a big, wagging tail. Ugh, how did I not realize that over time, not only had he grown taller and richer, but he had also developed such a dark, twisted sense of humor. Why was I even thinking about this? Why was I overthinking it? I needed to focus and prepare for the upcoming class placement exam instead. After finally pulling my thoughts back together to study for one whole period, during the break, someone shouted again, "Alice, someone's looking for you." I thought it was Steve Watson being annoyingly persistent, and I was about to scream like an angry lion when I saw that it wasn't him at all. Instead, standing at the door was none other than Marie Lin. Her skin was fair, her figure petite and delicate. It was only then that I noticed her hair had a slight chestnut tint. It looked dyed, but it was actually natural. Even the teacher, nicknamed the Big Bad Wolf, couldn't do anything about her. Not to mention, she could dance, sing, host events, and had excellent grades. She was every teacher's star pupil. These were all things I had overheard during the gossip session earlier at the opening ceremony. I couldn't ignore it even if I wanted to. But I still didn't know why she was looking for me. "Alice, sorry to bother you." Today, the teacher suddenly switched to a class with the headmaster. She bit her lower lip before speaking. "Could you lend me a politics book?" "Sure." This time, she was really borrowing a book. I quickly walked back to my seat, grabbed my geography book, and handed it to her. "Thank you. I'll return it to you after school." Her bright smile was like summer, beautiful and full of life. "No worries." I turned back to my seat, thinking about a detail I had just noticed. At first, when my classmate called my name, Marie Lin was still scanning the entire classroom. It wasn't until I stood up to face her that her gaze locked on me, and there was a fleeting look of confusion and curiosity. What did that mean? She didn't actually recognize me. Plus, her classroom was in the next building. There was no need for her to come all this way to borrow a politics book from someone she barely knew. It was clear, she used the excuse of borrowing a book just to come see who I was. She saw me as a rival, because Steve Watson had hugged me in front of everyone. So she likes Steve Watson. What a headache. I should find a chance to clear up this misunderstanding. I don't want a beautiful girl to have the wrong idea about me. Thinking about this, I went back to my seat, but I noticed that Chubby Boy's expression had darkened considerably. I thought for a moment and decided to check on him. "What's wrong?" "Nothing, it's just." He hesitated for a moment, but finally said, "I don't like her." Not liking someone basically means you dislike them. To openly say that, I was more convinced that Chubby Boys had some kind of backing. Otherwise, with his chubby and awkward appearance, not only did no one make fun of him, but he could also say whatever he wanted without anyone causing trouble. Suddenly, I saw Steve Watson in a new light and decided from now on, would treat him like a god, offering him 3 bows every morning and evening to show my respect. My curiosity kicked in. And I wanted to ask if Steve Watson had any issues with Marie Lin, but he just rested his head on his hand and looked at me with a disdainful snort before returning to his book. Did I offend him somehow? But honestly, I couldn't be bothered to figure out the truth. After school, Marie Lin returned my book and even invited me for ice cream as a thank you. No need for that. It's no trouble at all. So there I was, biting into my ice cream, as I confessed. I don't have the kind of relationship with Steve Watson that you think. She clearly didn't expect me to bring that up directly, and her face turned red in an instant. She looked like she wanted to say something but hesitated. I don't have the kind of relationship with him that you think either. She hesitated again. Sorry, it was silly of me to come to check on you like that before. No, we're friends now. I totally get it. For a moment, Marie Lin seemed like she had more to say, but in the end, she just gave me a gentle smile. The next day, the results of the placement exam were quickly posted on the bulletin board next to the cafeteria. After class, everyone rushed to see the list. I, being lazy as usual, didn't feel like pushing through the crowd, so I stood aside, waiting for the crowd to thin out before I went to check. I didn't expect that Marie Lin was also waiting, much like me. By this time, the school had issued the standard white and black uniforms, plain and simple, but somehow, Marie Lin looked particularly different in it. She was fidgeting with her sharp phone, opening and closing it repeatedly. She puckered her lips in frustration as if saying, "Ugh, it's almost time for class. Why is it so slow?" I wasn't sure who she was waiting for. Perhaps sensing that I was watching her, Marie Lin turned her head and flashed an innocent, radiant smile. "Alice," she called. "Marie Lin," I responded, just about to walk over to chat about the weather or maybe dream a little about the future. But before I could say anything, she had already stopped a passing boy. Class leader. The boy, wearing black-framed glasses, seemed a bit shy and couldn't believe at first that Marie Lin was addressing him. He glanced around as if to check if she was talking to someone else. Realizing there was no one else, he pointed to himself in disbelief. "Me? Are you going to check the class placement board? Could you help me take a look? The crowd is too thick for me to squeeze through." Marie Lin smiled slightly, looking even more radiant. "Ah, yes, of course." The class leader eagerly agreed, looking as though he had been granted a great honor. He turned around quickly and fought his way into the crowd, desperate to avoid another boy from stealing his chance to show off. Soon, the class leader emerged, sweating profusely, excitedly exclaiming, "You're in Class A, Marie Lin, same as me." Marie Lin smiled softly, her eyes curving. "Then, please take good care of me, class leader." His joy was evident, but there was nothing more to say. Still, the class leader was reluctant to miss this rare opportunity to be alone with her, and he struggled to think of something, anything, to extend the conversation. But Marie Lin had already said, "Sorry, I have something to do," and walked away. The class leader, still elated, watched her leave, and suddenly, with a determined look, raised his fist in a fighting gesture and shouted, "I'll do my best, Marie Lin." Watching this whole scene unfold, I couldn't help but retreat in sympathy. Afraid that his zero love IQ might somehow be contagious, I stepped back, hoping to avoid a genetic mutation into a complete fool. "Alice," someone suddenly grabbed my shoulders, stopping me from retreating further. Once I steadied myself and turned around, I realized it was Richard Stone. "Richard Stone, sorry, I bumped into you." Compared to Richard Stone's calm demeanor, I was clearly much more flustered. At that moment, his white shirt was billowing in the wind, and his eyes were burning, brighter than even the dazzling sunlight around us. The spot where his hand touched my shoulder seemed to be on fire. I took a moment to study this outstanding boy in front of me. I couldn't help but feel that he looked especially good in a uniform. His hair was blacker and finer than most, and his lips were a bit thin. His eyebrows and eyes were slightly long and narrow, giving him a cold, sharp look. Yet, the soft bangs hanging over his forehead softened his appearance. He belonged to the elite student type. Even in his uniform, he dressed meticulously, buttoning his sleeves up properly. Among the crowd of students wearing the same outfit, he still stood out, as if the rest of the world faded into the background. Steve Watson stood at the fork between two classrooms and encouraged me, "Good luck with the midterm." "Good luck to you too," I replied. After we said goodbye, I didn't return to my class immediately. Instead, I secretly followed Steve Watson. Until I saw him holding the other bottle and walking back to class 10A. Only then did I turn back. Sure enough, he was in class A. I looked down at my own class label, class 10H, with classes B, C, D, E, F, and G in between us. It really was far. But liking someone is truly a powerful force. It makes you want to turn great distances into something within reach. So, I charged into the library with newfound determination to study. However, after just one period of studying, I slumped over the desk in defeat, thinking I might as well give up. But at that very moment, when I was about to throw in the towel, I glanced at the empty bottle of pomelo tea Steve Watson had given me. The bottle was empty, yet somehow I could still feel the faint warmth from his hand. No matter what, I didn't want him to look down on me. That thought kept swirling in my mind, so instead of giving up, I buried myself in crafting a series of battle plans. Everything seemed perfect, but I had forgotten one thing: Class C's seat number 2 and Class H's seat number 2 would be in the same exam room. After the reshuffling, we ended up sitting next to each other. Looking at the smug grin on Steve Watson's face, I couldn't help but feel like I had been struck by a lightning bolt of bad luck. Feeling confident for the exam? Steve Watson asked me. Having stayed up late, I was running on low energy, ready to slump over the desk for a quick nap. But as I lazily lifted my eyes, I saw Richard Stone walk into the exam room, and in an instant, it felt like I had fully recharged. I boldly replied, "Yes, absolutely." "You don't need to force yourself," Steve Watson said kindly. "I understand." "Who needs your understanding? And what exactly do you think you understand?" I was about to retort when the exam proctor entered the room. So, I put away my books, turned off my phone, and sat up straight, ready for the exam. Fortunately, everything was just as I had planned. Welcome to the youth drama Summer Letters from Shuayan Street, written by Lu Lin Yan, proudly presented by Swan Lu Van Hoa. This is episode 6. Half of the exam time had passed. The invigilator walked back and forth around the exam room, checking the students. As he passed by me, I lifted the hem of my pleated skirt, which was covered with all the key points I needed. I had already learned that this invigilator was a male teacher. No matter how strict he was, he wouldn't dare to publicly inspect a girl's legs for cheating notes, would he? I was busy copying down my answers, but Steve Watson, sitting next to me, had already noticed my secret. His face was as pale as if a typhoon had just passed through. When the time was up, Steve Watson suddenly jumped up, grabbed both his and my exam papers, handed them to the invigilator, and without a word, dragged me out of the room. Ouch! It hurts! I yelled as he held my arm too tightly. But Steve Watson ignored me and continued pulling me along. On the way, a senior member of the student council with a righteous attitude stepped in and blocked us. "Excuse me, can I ask what you're doing?" he asked. "Shut up," Steve Watson glared at him threateningly. But the senior, with years of experience in the student council, wasn't scared off by a mere look. Instead, he took a step closer, raising his chin as he asked, "And what if I insist on intervening?" Without hesitation, Steve Watson quickly swung his right fist, stopping just 3 centimeters away from the senior's face, hitting the wall behind him hard. "Then this," he said decisively. Hearing the loud bang, students standing in the corridor turned to look. I saw the senior pinned against the wall, his eyes wide in disbelief. Steve Watson continued staring at him with a fiery gaze, as if ready to explode at any moment. The senior didn't say another word and stepped aside, allowing us to pass. "Show some backbone." I screamed internally as Steve Watson dragged me into an empty classroom, kicked the door open, and pulled me inside. He furiously yelled, "Alice, do you really need to go to such desperate lengths for an exam? How is that any of your business?" I shot back, refusing to back down. How is it not my business? I saw it all. The white panties with little cherry blossoms, I saw them, he shouted. What? I screamed, unable to control my embarrassment. People with low IQs do low IQ things. Your IQ is definitely in the negative. He was beyond agitated. If there's a next time, you're dead. Don't even think about it. With that, he stormed off. DABCB. The letters swiftly formed neatly under my pen. But just as I was trying to catch Steve Watson's answers, Richard Stone had already stood up. His back was straight, his demeanor calm and detached as always. BDCAD. Under the admiring gazes of the crowd, his fine bangs fell, half concealing his face. The clear and understated boy moved forward with light steps. His left foot stepped up the stairs, and I, Alice, murmured to myself, A. DCDB. He handed the test paper to the teacher, who smiled with satisfaction. Richard Stone walked to the classroom door, and as if sensing someone's gaze, he suddenly looked down in my direction. His lips curved into a small, warm smile. You know what? DBCBD. He turned his head and walked out of the classroom, the white hem of his shirt disappearing quickly from view, like a dove. You really don't know, do you? Who was the one who seemed so indifferent, yet so calm and composed? And who was the one whose heart was surging, unable to focus? When I recall this scene, I no longer know. It felt like in that moment, the world fell into silent stillness, leaving behind only a sea of quiet emotions within me. Even with Steve Watson helping me cheat, the result was still a mess. On the day the results were handed out, as I reached the bus stop outside the school gate, Steve Watson blocked my way, angrily asking what had happened. I didn't dare reveal my girlish feelings and instead lied, saying it was because of Linda. That I hadn't been able to study properly during that time because of him, and my grades in other subjects had pulled me down. To my surprise, Steve Watson didn't suspect a thing. In fact, after I pretended to be sad, he asked, "Is Linda not doing well? Should I go back to Shuayan Street with you? I haven't been back since I left." A wave of indescribable melancholy rose in my heart. Steve Watson. But at that moment, he was still full of excitement, continuing to ask, "I wonder what it looks like now. It must be beautiful, right? Are the wheat fields still there? Have the fruit trees grown taller? Remember how it used to get pitch black at night? And remember that time I pretended to be a ghost and scared you?" Suddenly, Steve Watson fell silent. I was just about to ask why he stopped when I met his gaze, which had become especially deep under the streetlight, like a still ocean, concealing emotions I couldn't fathom. Steve Watson slowly reached out, brushing away my bangs, and in the wind, his voice fell soft and tender, like it would dissolve with a breath. "Has that wound healed?" His fingers were cool, but the moment they touched my skin, it felt as though they set it on fire, hot and searing. His eyes were so deep and bright, as if they could pull me in completely. But I didn't move. I couldn't move. I don't know how long it lasted, until the 104 bus arrived. Alice snapped back to reality, awkwardly brushing off Steve Watson's hand. "It's healed." She didn't look at him again, hastily jumping onto the bus. "I'm leaving. Bye." Who could understand her feelings at this moment? When they first met, Alice had been proud and above everyone, but after a long period of separation, she had become an ordinary girl, with no remarkable talents, mediocre grades, carefree, and a bit rough around the edges. On the other hand, Steve Watson had grown to be excellent, handsome, and admired by everyone, someone she could only look up to from afar. Now, no new residents moved into Shuayan Street because the land had been bought by a developer. Everywhere, there were buildings under construction. Only Linda and Alice remained, becoming what people called the most stubborn residents. Linda refused to leave. The person she had once known used to live here, and when she bought the old house at number 23, it was already determined that she would never leave. Linda wanted to wait for that person, foolishly waiting, even though she knew he would never return. But still, she clung to the hope that maybe one morning or one evening, he would suddenly feel something and come back to find her. So, she remained here, always waiting. Over the years, the developers had tried everything, but Linda wouldn't budge. Now, Alice could see the construction site, where work had stopped for the night, and a large pit several hundred meters wide, filled with mud and water. Half-constructed steel frameworks and idle excavators and cranes stood like transformers. The once beautiful rose wall now had only the half that belonged to house number 23. The other half had been bulldozed, leaving a collapsed pile of bricks and dust. Even the climbing roses had long since died. The foundation work had dug 1 meter deep beneath the rose wall, making the 2-story building behind it even more precarious, teetering as if it might collapse at any moment. In the entire area, there was no one left but Linda and Alice. Alice pushed open the old wooden door, which was barely ajar, and called out, "Mom." There was no response from Linda. Alice quietly moved through the silence and dust, searching for her. As the twilight faded and the cool wind swept in from all directions, Linda lit a cigarette but didn't smoke, simply staring at the empty construction site below. She turned her head, her expression as desolate as the scenery. "You're back. The food is on the table. Eat dinner first. Underscore 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 as the stifling afternoon heat began to ease, we, myself, Marie Lin, Richard Stone, and Steve Watson, were walking along the corridor. The sun was so hot that beads of sweat appeared on our foreheads, but none of us paid it much mind, as the atmosphere was quite relaxed. Richard Stone maintained his usual calm demeanor, while Steve Watson, as always, seemed a bit bothered by the heat. He had loosened his tie, rolled up his sleeves, and was frequently wiping away the sweat. At this historical moment of the four gathering together, countless school clubs were swarming to hand out flyers. Compared to Richard Stone's gentle refusals and Marie Lin's friendly acceptance, Steve Watson was much less courteous. With his lips pressed tighter and tighter, anyone with a sense of reading the atmosphere quickly backed away. At that moment, I still had no idea how the clumsy B.O. managed to sprint up to Steve Watson and, with an aggressive 90-degree bow, hold up a flyer high above his head. "Oh, no," B.O. said, "Anon, I fell for you at first sight. Would you fall for me back?" As my mouth formed an "Oh," B.O., not getting a response, could only flee in shame. At that moment, Marie Lin suddenly stepped in front of him, seemingly trying to stop him, but B.O. accidentally tripped over Marie Lin's foot. Marie Lin quickly and skillfully caught him by the shoulder, preventing a full-on fall. B.O. raised his head, giving Marie Lin a complicated look, one that seemed like a mix of resentment and disgust. But before I could even process what was happening, B.O. had stumbled off. It seemed like Marie Lin was quite used to this kind of reaction from people, especially from the opposite gender. He remained calm and composed, even pulling B.O.'s love letter out of Steve Watson's pocket, placing it with the other flyers, and holding them above his head to shield his face from the sun. Then, he turned and gave us all a radiant smile. By now, it was around 35 degrees, and we were all feeling the heat. Steve Watson had already undone his tie, unbuttoned his shirt a little, and rolled up his sleeves, looking carefree. Meanwhile, Richard Stone, as always, maintained his immaculate appearance. Even his sleeves were precisely folded to just 5 centimeters above his wrist, revealing a sleek, minimalist watch, perfectly in line with his personality. Richard Stone was the type who didn't talk much, opting for the less is more approach, where every word carried weight. Yet, he never came off as arrogant. On the contrary, talking to him felt like an honor. Many girls admired him for this. And, admittedly, so did I. At that moment, he asked me, Alice, which club do you want to join? A little flustered by his attention, I replied, I want something easy, where I don't have to use my brain but can still get credit. Marie Lin widened his eyes and naively asked, is there such a club? Humph, exactly, because there isn't, I responded. Marie Lin squinted and smiled. If there is such a club, let me know, Alice. I'll join too. I nodded enthusiastically, but then Steve Watson suddenly raised his hand and playfully smacked me on the head. Stop dragging people down with you. If you want to slack off, fine, but don't bring 2CA into this. She's going to study in America one day. Rubbing my slightly aching forehead, I couldn't help but snap back, and you? As if joining the basketball club is going to turn you into the next Jong Shuheo or something. Chubby Boy was just about to lose his temper when, fortunately, Richard Stone stepped in to mediate. Alice, perhaps the broadcasting club might suit you. You just need to talk, no thinking required. Oh, the broadcasting club sounds great. I exclaimed. I only have to talk, no need for thinking, that's perfect. I shot Richard Stone an admiring look, and he smiled helplessly. But no matter how much I thought about it, I never expected that the broadcasting club would actually be located in the school's broadcasting room. Really, such efficient use of space. When I was younger, I used to practice piano and calligraphy, but later on, I stopped altogether. However, it's fortunate that my patriotism remained strong, which led to my English being so bad that I could only recognize ABC, sanitary pad, and TVB dramas from Hong Kong. But my Vietnamese was excellent. I could be the only student in the entire grade to get all the multiple-choice questions correct, and I could recite ancient texts from start to finish without missing a word. So, broadcasting seemed like something tailor-made for me. I decided to join the broadcasting club. After signing up, I was pleased to have taken care of something that had been bothering me. Moreover, since the four of us planned to go eat at a restaurant, and I could get a free meal, I was even happier. Since everyone had to return to their respective classes to grab their backpacks, we agreed to meet up after a few minutes. I purposely took the long route, going from Building B to Building A, just to walk with Marie Lin for a bit. The campus under the setting sun had a peaceful beauty. The sun, like a yolk, spilled its diluted light across the sky. But the oppressive heat lingered in the remnants of the sunlight. Marie Lin and I walked down the hallway, my pleated skirt lightly brushing against my knees, stirring an indescribable itch. Marie Lin, I looked at the girl next to me, who was softly humming along to the campus radio, and after biting my lower lip, I asked the question that had been in my heart for a long time, what's your relationship with Richard Stone? She immediately stopped walking, her gaze complicated as she stared at me for a long moment before asking with confusion, Alice, do you like Richard? I hurriedly shook my head. No, no. Just curious, that's all. Marie Lin suddenly patted me on the shoulder, and I felt like my soul was about to fly away. Seeing my terrified expression, she laughed innocently, Alice, I'm just like Richard's little sister. Ganbat. I breathed a sigh of relief, patting my chest as I joyfully said, really? Really? I can even be your strategist if you want. Marie Lin playfully hopped backward a few steps, standing at the intersection between the two buildings, waving at me and winking cheekily, see you later. I'll take you to True Love's favorite hotpot place. I waved back, then started walking toward Building B. As I walked up the stairs to the floor where my class was, a few girls came from the opposite direction. One of them, upon seeing me, nudged her friends curiously with her mouth. I didn't care and continued walking, but just as I passed by them, the girl called out to me, hey, stop. Even though she was a beauty, and I had a soft spot for handsome guys and pretty girls, they were my source of belief in the beauty of the world and my motivation to live, so when a beautiful girl told me to stop, naturally, I did. I stopped for a second, expressionless, before walking away again. I figured that was enough of a favor to the beauty, right? But I had only taken 2 steps when the girl swiftly caught up and blocked my path again. I turned my head. "What do you want?" Before the last word even faded into the air, someone grabbed my arm. It was like being stuffed into a sack as they dragged me forward. I had no idea what was going on or why that girl wanted to mess with me, but her aggressive stance gave me a bad feeling. Unfortunately, I couldn't outmatch her strength, so without thinking twice, I leaned in and bit down hard on her wrist. She yelped in pain and had no choice but to let me go. I bolted, legs working as fast as they could, while those girls shouted after me, "Stop! Stop! Stop your sister!" Only my sister would stop. I ran even faster. Each floor of this building had 3 staircases, 2 of them in Building A. There's also a hallway that connects to Building B near one of the staircases. The last staircase was in Building B. Just as I rushed down the stairs from the 5th floor of Building A, they were already spreading out, blocking the other staircases, determined to trap me. I dashed towards the 4th floor staircase, but my weakness from years of failing PE was catching up to me. By the time I got down, they had already positioned themselves at the exits on both sides of the 4th floor, waiting for me to walk right into their trap. Why didn't I run up to the 6th floor, you ask? Only someone crazy would do that. I'm not crazy. Running downwards gives me a chance to escape, running up would just mean I'd end up spending the night on the rooftop. They could just hang out below, playing music, eating ramen, playing cards, enjoying the breeze, and watching handsome guys play basketball. Seeing no way out, with pursuers ahead and behind, I quickly assessed the situation. The girl blocking my path was short and looked frail. I feigned a charge to her right side, and sure enough, she moved to block me. At the last second, I pivoted to her left, catching her off guard, and burst through her defenses. Eyes squeezed shut, I dashed towards Building B. Building B is mainly for the senior students, as it's a smaller building with fewer classrooms, designed for efficiency. There are only 3 floors, saving time for the seniors who need every spare second. In their world, every second saved means solving a 5-star math problem, memorizing 10 chemistry formulas, or learning 20 English words. But this year's senior class is smaller by 2 sections, leaving 2 vacant classrooms, both on the 3rd floor. With no one around, the 3rd floor looked eerily empty, almost spooky. I didn't have time to worry about the creepiness. With my pursuers hot on my tail, I ran to the deepest part of the 3rd floor. At the far end was an empty classroom. Outside the classroom were stacks of old or broken desks and chairs. I rushed inside and locked the door behind me. Ha! No way they could catch me now. Feeling smug, I turned around to survey the room. It was a classroom that hadn't been used for a while, the kind left over from last year's senior class. The blackboard was still covered with farewell messages from students, and the desks had paper planes inside their drawers. Some CDs had even been left behind. I glanced at the pile of exam papers, so many that they could be sold by weight. The ridiculously ugly school uniform was secretly hidden in the least noticeable corner. As I looked down, I completely abandoned the idea of jumping out of the window. Those girls outside, realizing they couldn't get in, started shouting and swearing. "If you've got guts, come out here." What's the point of hiding? Well, if eating counts as having guts, then I guess I've got none left. "Oh, little girl, your mouth is still sharp, huh? Hee hee, thank you for the compliment, big sister." "You call me big sister? You're the big sister. Your whole family is big sisters." Even though there was a door between us, I could clearly imagine that girl's dyed hair fluttering in frustration. I was about to chuckle when I overheard them, realizing they hadn't given up just yet. Instead, they seemed to be planning something. A moment later, there was a loud scraping noise outside, accompanied by more sarcastic remarks. "Humph, does she even know who she is? Acting all high and mighty. Better stay away from Lu Lin Yan, or else. Both the front and back doors were blocked. Good luck spending the night in there. After some hurried footsteps, the girls gradually walked away. I tried pushing the door, but it was indeed blocked by broken desks and chairs, making it impossible to open. Welcome to the Painful Youth novel series, Letters from the Summer of Water's Edge Street author, Liao Qiao Yanba by Niao. Episode 8. I stared at the door for a long time before I noticed my wrist was hurting. Looking down, I realized at some point someone's fingernail had scratched me, leaving a long mark. The edges of the cut were pinkish, and a small trickle of blood was visible. I walked to the window, feeling the sting of the wound. Being on the third floor, I could see the lush treetops swaying like floating green clouds in front of my eyes. Below was a pond filled with koi fish. At that moment, I had no intention of pulling a Chu Yuan by jumping into the pond, so I composed myself and decided to find another way out through the door. Those girls thought they had blocked my exit, but they had unknowingly helped me. I pushed some desks toward the door, stacking a chair on top of them. Wobbling a bit, I climbed up and opened a small window above the door, about 30 centimeters in diameter. Given my flat chest, which had always made me feel self-conscious, I now felt a strange sense of pride. Being flat-chested had its advantages. I could easily squeeze through the window without any trouble. However, once half my body was hanging outside, I realized the situation wasn't as I had imagined. I had pictured neatly arranged desks and chairs that would allow me to drop down without injury. Instead, the upturned chairs, with their sharp legs sticking out, dangled dangerously. I was stuck, unable to move forward or back, wanting to cry but too overwhelmed to shed tears. I don't know how long I hung there, but just when my hands, gripping the window frame, were about to give out, I heard hurried footsteps echoing through the hallway, like a bolt of lightning cutting through the silence. Someone was calling me. At that moment, I thought I was hallucinating. By this time, the school was empty. Who would still be here? But in that moment, it felt like I was seeing light in the darkness, like finding a lifeline in the water. How could I let go of whoever was my savior? So timely, such a rescue. Overwhelmed with joy, I finally let out a desperate shout, "I'm here." But to my surprise, since I hadn't spoken for a while and was tilted awkwardly, when I opened my mouth, I choked on my own saliva. I coughed violently, unable to breathe properly, and the voice seemed to drift further away, heading upstairs. "Don't go, please don't leave, come back." I thought frantically, but the voice grew fainter and farther away. I coughed and felt a wave of despair as I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, I saw Richard Stone. At that moment, the hibiscus trees at school were in full bloom, flowers covering the branches like clouds. Richard Stone was running toward me, stepping through the light of the motion-activated lamps. He asked, "Sue, are you okay?" I once read a story about a child who fell at home and didn't cry. His mother said, "You're so brave, you didn't even cry." The child replied, "I thought there were grown-ups at home, so I didn't cry." At that moment, I was like that child. I hadn't realized how bad my situation was, but as soon as someone asked, the sadness overwhelmed me, and tears streamed down my face. I shook my head repeatedly, "I'm not okay. I'm not okay at all." Richard Stone quickly climbed onto the stacked desks and chairs, balancing himself. He said to me, "All right, stop crying. Save your energy. I'll take you out to eat something delicious later." I really stopped crying and said, "I'll eat something delicious and then have the strength to keep crying." He smiled helplessly and said, "You're really clever, still able to talk back, things can't be that bad. Sue, can I carry you down now?" I nodded calmly, but no one knew the storm of emotions surging within me at that moment. His embrace was both warm and cool, both sweet and bitter. It filled me with contentment, yet also tore me apart inside. So later, during the time when Richard Stone disappeared, on many sleepless nights, I would replay this memory in my mind, like rewinding and rewatching an old movie over and over again. And after he passed away, for a long time, he became the only reason I could keep going, my only comfort. I will always remember every little detail from that night. I'll never forget it, never, even if I die. That night, after he carried me down, I remained silent. The motion-activated lights in the stairwell lit up with each of our steps. We walked slowly, with him in front, his shadow stretched long and thin. I quietly stepped into his shadow, and for a moment, our shadows overlapped, like we were an inseparable pair. I was secretly delighted by this sudden surge of girlish affection, but he had no idea what was going through my mind. Just when I was still feeling scared, Richard Stone suddenly turned to me and said, "Alice, how about I show you a magic trick?" My eyes immediately lit up. "Sure." His smile was as bright as the moonlight. "You start counting down from 10. 10, in the courtyard, the jasmine flowers were blooming all over, their small white buds filled with energy. The delicate fragrance lingered at the tip of my nose. 9, the moon was so beautiful tonight. It hung high in the sky, and even the stars had come out to join. Was that the North Star? Always in the brightest spot, unwavering, providing direction and a sense of safety. 8, the red brick walls of the school and the abundance of pines stood together, weaving a heavy and profound atmosphere. A small patch of pine was silhouetted against the moon, and even the edges of the needles were lined with a cool silver gray. They swayed and shimmered, stirring the moonlight like water. 7, out of nowhere, a cat appeared, letting out a soft meow, startling me. But Richard Stone remained completely unfazed. My thoughts were interrupted. Had I messed up the count? 6, no, I was still on track. The cat just passed by that magnolia tree. In the quiet of the campus, the faint rustling sound it made was a bit irritating. Oh, a magnolia flower petal had been dislodged by the cat and floated gently onto the curtain. 5, Richard Stone stood right in front of me, wearing a crisp white shirt. His right hand was in his pocket, while his left hand naturally rested on the curtain. His long fingers were neatly trimmed, revealing smooth white edges. The flower had landed just in front of his hand. 4, we remained silent, saying nothing. In moments like these, even breathing and blinking felt drawn out and unnecessary. It was like we were in a dream, and I was afraid that a single breath would shatter it, a single blink would wake me up. 3, a breeze blew by, playfully brushing his hair aside, revealing his eyes that were as bright as stars. He gazed at me directly, with a determined smile that sent my heart racing. My heart skipped a beat. Am I going to die of happiness? 2, could he really be about to perform a magic trick? If it were any other guy, I'd probably scoff and think, yeah, right. But this was Richard Stone. It felt like he really had come just for me. I believed he was going to surprise me with something magical. 1, in the quiet hallway, I thought I heard the soft chime of Richard Stone's watch. 0, in the blink of an eye, all the streetlights on the campus lit up at once. Under the warm yellow glow, the school that had seemed so harsh and rigid during the day was now draped in a soft, time-worn elegance, as if it had shed its cocoon and turned into a butterfly, becoming something stunning. It was like the misty beauty of Jiangnan or the dusk of a desert, where the earth and sky merged into one harmonious hue. It was as if the rainy sky had a sickness, an endless gray that brought a kind of oppressive yet genuine beauty. Even Richard Stone, standing under the streetlight, looked stunningly beautiful, almost heart-stopping. What was that song lyric? Your silhouette is too beautiful, I hold back my tears to take a closer look. Richard Stone wore a satisfied, almost mischievous smile. You could see his gentle grin, the streetlight casting delicate shadows on his eyelashes. This is the magic I performed for you. I thought to myself that I would never, ever forget this moment. Not in this life, not in the next, or the one after. In this moment, a boy, just to make me happy, had brought together heaven and earth to give me a sudden, unforgettable surprise. The row of shining streetlights stretched out like a river. I was moving upstream, all for the boy in my heart. I pressed my hand against my chest, afraid that the words of confession would rush out too fast, making my feelings unclear or scaring him away. "What's wrong?" Richard Stone looked at me, and for a moment, it was as if we had both fallen into a dream where only the two of us existed. We slowed our steps, even our breathing became softer. Even if this was just a dream, I wanted to live it to its fullest. But just then, another voice interrupted my confession. "Alice." Startled, I glanced out the window. It was Steve Watson standing by the A building, waving at me excitedly. Before I could respond, he disappeared. Moments later, the empty hallway echoed with the sound of rapid footsteps, and within 10 seconds, Steve Watson had come running over. He was shouting as he ran, "Alice, are you okay?" "I'm not okay." I was annoyed the moment I saw Steve Watson, especially since he had interrupted my rare opportunity to confess. "Can you disappear for a moment and let me finish confessing?" "What's wrong? Where are you hurt?" He didn't understand my frustration and anxiously grabbed my hand, looking me over from top to bottom, repeatedly checking. Once he was convinced I was fine, he said, "It's just a scratch on your hand, no big deal." I glared at him and asked, "Why are you here?" "I was about to confess." "Couldn't you have shown up after that?" He explained, "Didn't we agree to meet for dinner? We waited for you for a long time, but you didn't show up, so we thought maybe you had to leave early." The three of us went ahead to eat. But halfway through, I couldn't stop thinking that you're not the type to just leave without saying anything, so Richard Stone and I came back to look for you. And as it turns out, something really did happen. It turned out that while those girls had been messing with me, thinking no one else was around, they had been chatting carelessly as they went downstairs. As Richard Stone and Steve Watson were walking past the first floor of a building, they overheard them talking about me, saying things like, "She's locked in there, serves her right." The two boys exchanged a glance and decided to wait by the wall near the staircase. When the girls came down to the first floor, Steve Watson suddenly appeared from the side, still with his usual carefree attitude. "Hey, you're talking about Alice from Class H1, right?" The girls, still caught up in their conversation, reflexively answered, "Yeah, so what?" It wasn't until they turned around and saw that it was Steve Watson asking the question that their smug expressions started to falter. The girl was so frightened by Steve Watson's furrowed brows and fierce expression that she started to retreat. "Do you dare say that again?" His threatening tone made her take several steps back before she stammered, I don't know." Once she had retreated far enough, she turned and quickly ran away. Steve Watson was about to pull her back and question her further, but Richard Stone said that I was probably still trapped somewhere and that rescuing me was more important. Reluctantly, Steve Watson let go of his initial thought. At the time, they were both in Building A, and to save time, they split up to search from opposite ends of the building. After searching the entire building and still not finding me, Steve Watson asked, could she be locked in the girls' bathroom? But Richard Stone had already turned his gaze toward the B building, which they hadn't searched yet. So, they split up again. Steve Watson went to check the girls' bathroom, while Richard Stone headed to the B building. As it turned out, Richard Stone's hunch was right, and he found me before Steve Watson did. Laughing carelessly, I said, what can I say? Low IQ, that's just how it is. Steve Watson, who had just come back from the girls' bathroom, looked furious and annoyed. Is that how you treat your savior? Pfft, you. My savior? What am I supposed to do for my savior, then? I couldn't continue my sentence because the rest of what I wanted to say was, should I offer myself as repayment? Luckily, Richard Stone didn't catch on and just asked, do you know who those girls were? I nodded and then shook my head. I don't know them. Could you recognize them? If I could, I'd teach them a lesson tomorrow, Steve Watson said. I nearly choked on my drink. Are you serious? You want me to get into trouble because of you? Enough already, beauties are nothing but trouble, I thought to myself. But I didn't dare call Steve Watson a beauty, nor did I dare label him as trouble. Knowing his petty nature, he would definitely come back to haunt me for that, with interest. After a moment, Steve Watson, oblivious as ever, slapped his forehead and exclaimed, "Oh. No, Marie Lin is still waiting for us. Let's hurry up." So, the three of us took a cab. Richard Stone sat in the front seat while Steve Watson and I sat in the back. When we arrived at the restaurant, Richard Stone was the first to pull out his wallet and pay the fare. But after we got out of the cab, he didn't move and just stood there. Confused, Steve Watson asked, "What's wrong? Let's go inside." "I just remembered I need to buy something," Richard Stone said, turning his head to look at something. Then, turning back, he said, "You go ahead and take Alice inside. I'll join you soon." Steve Watson was still puzzled but nodded and took the lead. I followed him closely but couldn't help looking back, worried about Richard Stone. I wondered if something was wrong, maybe he wasn't feeling well. Noticing my concern, Richard Stone waved at me. "Go ahead. I'll be there soon." Reluctantly, I followed Steve Watson into the hot pot restaurant. Marie Lin was already sitting there, looking bored, resting his chin on his hand. His eyes seemed to be wandering aimlessly, like a cat full and lazy, basking in the warm sunlight, just waiting for its owner to take it home. It wasn't until Richard Stone waved his hand in front of Marie Lin's face that he snapped out of his daze, smiling brightly. "Oh, you're back. Alice, are you okay?" Feigning frustration, I shouted, "No. No, I'm not okay. I'm starving." The hot pot was still bubbling, and at this point, my cravings were completely stirred up. My eyes lit up as I picked up my chopsticks, ready to dive into the feast. But just as I had eaten 2 pieces of beef, Marie Lin looked troubled and said she had to leave. She came from a well-off family, and her parents were strict. They had a rule that unless something special happened, she had to be home by 8 p.m., and it was already nearing that time. I quickly swallowed a large piece of fatty beef and slapped Steve Watson on the shoulder. "Hey, what are you waiting for? Go on, flower guardian, take the flower home." Steve Watson frowned, "And what about you?" My heart skipped a beat, wondering if Steve Watson had guessed my plan, but I still pretended to be innocent and said, I'll keep eating the hot pot. I'll take bus 104 home later." "Humph. And I'll even send you a safe home text." "Oh, but please settle the bill before you leave." Steve Watson remained silent, his expression dark as if he wanted to say something but couldn't bring himself to. After a long pause, he stood up and, turning to Marie Lin, said, "Let's go, I'll take you home." Marie Lin secretly winked at me in thanks, while Steve Watson, hands in his pockets, walked ahead without even stopping at the counter to pay. Oh, great, I thought, he's angry. Doi ten nan vat, and 1-Linda to 2-Alice Luke Lam non-Steve Watson Noyet 2 ca-Marie Lin co vui-Richard Stone a sin-Buddy.